Okay, greetings everyone, and welcome to the presentation on description. You're going to need a couple of the handouts before we get started. First of all, you're going to need the handout that's titled the same thing as the presentation, which is Description for the Personal Narrative. You're also going to need the essay Father by Jan Gray. This essay was posted in the description subfolder. You're also going to need the mentor texts that we've done so far, but most specifically, you're going to need school days and white food, because I will address those specifically in the presentation. Okay, here we go. All right, we are going to talk about description because it's one of those vital components of a well-told story. The first thing that we're going to talk about is structure. Part of the way description is done in a text, it does pay attention to the way the description is structured. So you can go through time. Any kind of description can start at the beginning and go all the way chronologically through to the end. Episodic grouping is where you might have like little vignettes or little anecdotes that are all put together to create an overall description. And then there's more obvious kind of structural strategies, such as picture like a really vivid scene in your head. Let's say you're going to look at a beach. All right, so it could be like when I'm thinking of this specifically, I'm thinking of Third Beach in Washington State. It's my favorite beach. You walk through like a half a mile of the Hoh rainforest, and then all of a sudden you are at a clearing and you crawl over probably like 30 or so feet of logs, and you have to crawl over them until you can get to the beach. So if I'm picturing that scene, I could describe Third Beach through an approaching structure. So I could be talking about the rainforest, describing that, and then describing how the trees are thinning out, and slowly there's more sky, and then all of a sudden there's all the logs, and that would be me approaching the beach. So that would be as I'm getting there. As the bird flies, if I did that kind of description of the beach, I would be a bird flying above it and doing the description from like looking down at it. So I would probably see the trees and the logs and the beach, but I'm going to be seeing it from a top view. And then there's scanning techniques. First, it could be from left to right. So if I was on the beach, I might talk about the different trees that are kind of out in the middle of the water, and I could go from left to right describing those. I could go from right to left. Top to bottom for the beach would be a little strange, but I could describe the sky and then get down to the water and then get down to the sand if I wanted to. Then I could also go near to far. So then I could talk about what I'm seeing right up close to me and then zooming out like a camera till way out wide. And then I could go from the center all the way out to the edge. Now again, if I was doing that in a description of the beach, I'd probably have to be in the water in order to do that. And I would have to start in the water and then move out to maybe the edge of the shore. So those are very specific structural ways that a description can be written. Okay, next we're going to talk about the 4 components of description. There's naming, there's detailing, there's comparing, and then there's sensory description. Now, when you think about that, the naming and the detailing are those really specific nouns. So naming is just nouns, right? You're going to be really specific about what you're describing. The white food essay is the one that comes to mind right now, and we will look at this more specifically in a couple slides, but what I'm remembering from that essay that stands out when I think of naming is how she named all the food. I mean, it was like a tour of the 80s and 90s with microwave food, those Swanson Hungry Man dinners, and the Steakums, and the combos, and that's all really specific proper nouns, and she's naming all of those brands to help you really get a great idea of all the American food that she was consuming. Details are in the adjectives. So one of the things that comes to mind later is when she's at her friend's house and she talks about the chopped up celery sticks and the unsweetened applesauce. So she doesn't just say they served applesauce. She makes sure that you know that it's unsweetened, because that's a stark contrast compared to the kind of American food that she was eating. And so that's detailing. Anytime you add adjectives in front of your naming, that's your detailing. Comparing is all about figurative language. So it's incorporating similes, metaphors, and personification. When we get to the specific essays, one of my favorite essays to talk about with figurative language is School Days. So I'm going to pull some of the paragraphs out of there and talk about some of that figurative language in there. But comparing is a really wonderful way to do description in narrative. Be careful though with figurative language. It's very easy to make it trite and cliche, so you have to be really careful that the figurative language is specific. And then there's sensory description, and that's where you're going to use your 5 senses. What you can see, what you can hear, what you can smell, what you can taste, and what you can touch. So all of that are the components of description. Now, I want to point out to you that on this page, please know that the screenshot of the TED Ed video is not a link. You can't click on it and get there, but I will tell you that I have included the link under the description subfolder in D2L. It's a great TED overall makes great videos. This TED Ed video, even though that it's focused on description in fiction writing, all of the things they talk about in this video can easily be applied to telling a personal narrative. So it's a great video. If you feel like you want to augment your knowledge with extra resources, this is a great one. Okay, next, we're going to talk about creating a dominant impression. And so whenever I talk about a dominant impression, I want you to think that a dominant impression is kind of like a thesis statement or a main idea, but it's the thesis and main idea of a description. So whereas a narration might have a so what, and an expository essay might have a main idea, and a persuasive essay might have a thesis, a description is going to have what we call a dominant impression. And a dominant impression is the overall like feeling or understanding of whatever you're describing. So, for example, I always like to think about the Minnesota State Fair when I think of dominant impression. And just to back up a little bit, I will tell you that whenever I go to the fair, I do not drive there. I take the bus. And a long time ago, before they cleaned up and made that bus entrance really nice, it used to be that you got out of the bus in this like shale parking lot and you went up some stairs and walked over like a bridge that went over the road. And then you were coming down into the fair. And so when I picture the dominant impression of the fair, I'm always standing up on that bridge, but right before I go down into the fair. And if you remember this at all, I'll tell you it was right by the Miracle of Life barn. So depending on the day that you went to the fair and how hot it was, you could have a very different dominant impression standing up there. So you might be standing up on that bridge and you might be thinking, let's say it was a really hot day and it's at the very end of the fair. Your dominant impression might be, oh boy, it stinks, right? Or if you go on a day where it's like 100 degrees, your dominant impression could be, oh my gosh, it's so hot. Or if you go on a night of a really big concert, you could be standing on that bridge and going, there are about 1 million people here, right? It is so crowded. So all of those would be really large dominant impressions or overall ideas about what the scene is in front of you. Okay, so if you look at some of the pictures here that I have of the fair, you can see Martha's Cookies. So maybe if you're writing a description and you're approaching the Martha Cookies stand, you might be thinking, oh my gosh, it smells amazing. And that's your dominant impression. And then you would launch in to how you're feeling as you're describing approaching the stand, buying the cookies, and maybe even eating them. Now, the crowded picture below that, that would be your dominant impression of, oh my gosh, there's way too many people here. Right? You can see the Miracle of Life barn on the lower left-hand side of the screen. Your dominant impression, like I said, could be, oh my gosh, it stinks, or oh, the babies are so cute, or something like that. I think you get the idea. Overall, a dominant impression is the main idea of a description, and it's your overall thinking about the scene you're witnessing. Okay, so how is this incorporated into a personal narrative? Here's where I would like for you to pause the presentation and read the essay Father by Jan Gray. This is a student essay, which means that a college freshman wrote this essay. And I want you to look for the following. I want you to read it. Can you find a dominant impression? What is Jan Gray's dominant impression of her father? Look for the naming, look for the detailing, look for the comparing, and see how the essay is structured. Once you've done all that, I want you to read it and annotate it for all of those look fors. Then I want you to come back to the presentation where I will talk through the essay. Okay, so now you've read the essay Father by Jan Gray. And one of the things I want to talk about first is the dominant impression of the essay. And if you look at the very first sentence of the essay, dominant impressions are almost always listed as a short sentence as the first sentence of a description. So if you look at the first sentence of Jan Gray's essay, it says, "My father's hands are grotesque." Well, there's her overall impression of her father's hands, because what follows that is a description of his hands. And if you want to think of the naming and the detailing here, where you've got massive, thick hands with scaly, reddish patches, they'd flake off, sending tiny pieces of dead skin sailing to the ground. There's your metaphor, right? The fingers are permanently stained a dull yellow. You've got color imagery. You can see it. You can picture it. And you're probably thinking, yeah, sounds gross, which again was her dominant impression. Now, if you look structurally at this, we're starting very small. We're looking at just her father's hands. If you look at the second paragraph, we're zooming out a little bit. We're getting from his hands to his whole person. And when you look at his person, again, the description's very specific, lots of naming and detailing. You've got cigarette burns, food stains, right? You're starting to really picture him. You can really see it. And again, you might be thinking gross, which I think is still the dominant impression. Now, if you move out, we go from his hands to his body to his apartment. So we're zooming out even further here. And now you get a whole description of the apartment with lots of detailing, okay? Now, the next part you have, you're zooming out even further. So we went from his hands to his body to the way he lives. And now we're moving to an entire episode about how he treats her. And that forms the rest of the narrative, because this whole little anecdote is all about how she came home to her house and her father had wrecked her bedroom to teach her responsibility. Now, remember, at the end of this, you might be thinking, wow, her father looks gross, lives grossly, and treats her gross. So you can see that the overall dominant impression of the entire essay is that her father is grotesque. Now, that's her dominant impression of the whole thing of her father. And then that also leads to the so what, because at the very end of the essay, she really does worry. It's the last couple lines where she says, after all, he is my father. Am I not supposed to feel some responsibility for him and to love and honor him? She's obviously struggling with that. There's guilt. She feels like he's gross and she feels bad about feeling that way. So that's why she told you all of this. Okay, so we've talked about the naming and the detailing, as well as the structure and the overall dominant impression. Okay, so now I want you to take another break, and I want you to look at the 4 mentor texts that we've read. We've read School Days, The Physics of Forbidden Love, The Good Daughter, and What White Food Meant to a First-Generation Kid. Again, you have the same look fors. Where's the naming, the detailing, the comparing? Where's the figurative language? Where's the sensory detail? How is it structured? And what's the dominant impression? I will tell you for this presentation, I'm going to focus on School Days and White Food. So maybe look at those first. Pause the presentation here, look at those 2 essays, and then come back and I'll go through both of them. Okay, we're going to start with what white food meant to a first-generation kid. You heard me earlier in the presentation where I did talk a little bit about all of the wonderful naming and detailing in this essay. I'm looking first at the 4th paragraph, where the one that starts, the year was 1986, I was 10 years old, and my family was on the fast track to expert-level American. We were the first on our block to get a microwave, where my mother said we could zap and nuke our food. And then she starts, and by the way, those 2 words, zap and nuke, even though they're in quotes, are fantastic. What great words for microwaving. And then she says, I zapped a Sara Lee frozen pound cake. Well, she could have just said pound cake. There's your naming. And now the detailing comes in Sara Lee and Frozen, right? And so that's very specific. And then she says, we peeled back the plastic wrap on Swanson's Hungry Man TV dinners. Again, TV dinners is your naming, and then the detailing is the Swanson's Hungry Man. Now, she does that quite a bit. If you're looking further down in the essay that starts, for my parents, American was often synonymous with white. That's where she talks about going to her friend's house. And you're noticing again, I think I mentioned this earlier, she mentions unsweetened applesauce, baked chicken breasts, celery sticks, right? And again, you've got chicken breasts would be, or just chicken would be the naming, and then the detailing is that they're baked, and then it's just the white meat. So that is the specificity there. Further down, you've got, again, the movies she was watching. Cannonball Run. She doesn't just say movies, she names them, right? National Lampoon's European Vacation. She talks about Combo's baked snacks. So not just snacks, but you've got Combo's baked snacks. She mentions, again, there's more naming, The Cosby Show, Dallas, Dynasty, The Price is Right, Press Your Luck. All of those very specific TV shows are named. Now, if you look at the second page, you'll notice that there's even more naming when she gets to Spam noodle soup, Spam and rice, Kraft mac and cheese, but Spam's mentioned a lot in here. So there's your naming and your detailing. Now, as far as the structure, it's very episodic. So you've got the very beginning with the whole, it's the kind of setting the scene for what it was like in her household. And then you've got the background on her parents. And then you've got the whole TV thing. And then you've got her friends and relationships after that. So you've got these little episodes with that incorporate all the naming and the detailing. Now, the dominant impression of this essay comes towards the end, where you start to understand. It's really, well, okay, the last three paragraphs really form the so what of this essay, where she talks about, okay, it's at near the end of the paragraph, where she says, I'd hungrily devoured what I had believed to be American normalcy, but I was still seen as being American adjacent. Maybe there was no such thing as American normalcy, or maybe the normalcy was in itself a performance. Now, this alludes back to the James Baldwin quote that's earlier on this page, where she says that the American media is designed not to trouble, but to reassure. And that how later Americans have this addiction to comfort. So all of that is kind of connected, because she's saying that all this normal American stuff was this performance. It was an illusion. And she mentions that again at the end, where she says, it's at the last paragraph. Yet once in a while, I feel a sharp envy for people who can eat whatever they want with no repercussions, though maybe it's only envy for the innocence of 1986, an innocence that never truly existed, and how I used to make a beeline for the burger stand at the mall food court, extra cheese, onion rings, a milkshake to wash it down, or eat a microwave dinner that the food never tasting quite as good as the shiny pictures on the box appeared, in front of a blaring TV, unable to look away. Now, again, that whole idea of illusion. So the meals that came out of those frozen TV dinners was never as good as the food looked or appeared on the box, right? And the food that she was eating wasn't as good for her as she wanted it to be, because look, then she got sick. So the dominant impression, like what's her overall impression of American food and living this American adjacent life, is that American life is this illusion, and there is your dominant impression, which is really building through the whole piece. Okay, if we move on to school days, I want to talk a little bit about the figurative language. I highlighted 3 paragraphs that I want to talk through. The first one is paragraph 3, so if you can get there in your own text. But I'm looking about the middle of the paragraph where it says, at 6 years of age, I lived in a world of confusion. The language, the kids, the culture spun around me like a vortex. That is a fantastic simile, because you can see between the verb spun, and the like a vortex, which is the simile, you really get this idea of swirling and confusion, right? And she uses the word confusion a little bit further up. But you get this whole idea of like feeling like she's in a blender, just swirled around, chaos, like tornado-ish kind of feeling, right? And you can understand that because, again, at this point, she didn't know the language yet. So, of course, everything felt like it was swirling around her, very confusing. So that simile does really do a lot for that paragraph. I pulled in paragraph 5 because I wanted to talk about another device that we didn't really cover yet. I talked about figurative language being similes, metaphors, and personification, but here specifically you have an illusion, and it's in the third line where it says, she relied heavily on her own experience as a basis of understanding the world, and just as the Wizard of Oz had nothing in his bag for Dorothy, she had nothing to smooth this assimilation for me. Well, there you go. That's an allusion to the Wizard of Oz. Right? So if you remember, if you've seen The Wizard of Oz, you know at the end of the movie when they finally kill the witch and go back and find the, Oz standing behind the curtain, right? You know that he comes out and that's when he gives what? Oh gosh, I might mess this up. Who gets the heart? Someone gets the hearts. I think, oh gosh, I can't remember. The lion gets courage. The scarecrow gets a brain, the Tin Man gets a heart. There, I got it. Okay, there you go. And Dorothy remembers she wants to go home. So the Oz had all of these things in his bag to give all of Dorothy and her friends what they wanted. And so here, that's a nice illusion because, at the end, there's nothing in the bag for Dorothy. And that's why Glenda, the good witch, shows up and Dorothy has to click her heels 3 times to go home. Now, here, she's alluding to that because she's saying it's like her mother, was just like the Wizard of Oz. There's nothing in the bag, nothing to help her. She's just going to have to figure it out on her own. That's an illusion. It's fantastic. It's really well done there. Now, paragraph 9, I like a lot because of the personification. The English language is personified here as hiding in the shadows and hiding from her and refusing to come out and play. It's kind of that idea. So if you listen to some of the words in this paragraph, it's just so well done. At school, things were no better. The teacher's instructions would wash over me like a wave. By the way, there's a simile. Nice job. I heard the sounds but didn't understand their purpose. But eventually, slowly and unexpectedly, the English language revealed itself to me. So there you have it being personified. It's like it's hiding. It said, ta-da, here I am. It revealed itself to me. Every new word and every new definition was like lifting a layer of film from my eyes, giving me clarity to see the world around me. So you have was like lifting a layer of film. There's your simile. Words empowered me and I pursued their secrets. So here the words are holding secrets. They're being personified again. So I love that part. And then, by the way, to keep up with that whole English hiding in the shadows, it having secrets, later down she does use some great words when she says, but its tiny print and archaic language did more to obscure meaning than shed light on it. Again, quite lovely language there. Okay, now it's your turn to try this. What I'd like for you to do, if you look at the 4th page of your handout on description for the personal narrative, you'll see that there are directions for interviewing a place. Now, there have been some modifications between that handout and what's on D2L because this is an online environment. So you're going to take 10 minutes to interview a place. You can go anywhere, but I recommend you go somewhere. And it should be somewhere where it's crowded and there's people and there's stuff going on around you. So a restaurant, a coffee shop, you can come to campus, sit in the Cop Center, the Japanese garden. It might be a little cold, but there you go. Somewhere where there's people. And I want you to sit and I want you to watch. 10 minutes. You're going to focus on your senses. You're going to take notes. You're going to work on that naming and detailing. And the figurative language stuff you might be able to fill in later, but you could try it at the moment. So 10 minutes just to sit there and absorb and write down all the notes you can. And then you're going to come to the discussion board. You're going to start with a dominant impression of the scene, and you're going to write a description. And then after that, we're going to start working on putting your description in your personal narrative. Okay, that's it. Please let me know if you have any questions, and I hope you have fun interviewing your place.